Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Very recently, the Malaysian Institute of Accountants has organised the MIA International Accountants Conference at the KL Convex. I was there, as I am every year, to attend that particularly important conference. This year it's a little bit more interesting because the guest of honour at the opening ceremony was the Deputy Finance Minister, Datuk Sri Ahmad Maslan. In his opening speech, he said that the government is looking to amend the Accountants Act 1967. There are other financial reforms that is intended to be done, and throughout the conference, we're looking at how the conversation is going to actually improve the public sector financial reform as well as the private sector as well. Joining us in the studio is Henning Dederik, the Manager for Public Sector Financial Reporting at the ICAEW, or the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Henning, thanks for taking the time to come over. There's a lot of things that we can discuss, but one of the things that was highlighted, at least by the Edge Malaysia, they quoted you in saying that the political will is actually the more important element when it comes to implementing public sector financial management reforms. Where do you feel the political will situation is when it comes to Malaysia in improving our financial management?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. Really delighted to be here. I also attended the MII conference and I spoke about PFM reforms. And in the opening address by the Deputy Finance Minister, he mentioned accruals accounting to put that back on the map. So, I mean, for me, I could sort of see there are, glimmers of hope to something to latch onto, So I think, operating or working as an accountant in the public sector, at the end of the day, what I've learned out of years of experience is that, you can put all the best processes into practice and into place, but ultimately it is politics that trumps everything. So, for example, in the UK, we were looking to implement the whole of government accounts, but at the time there wasn't actually the political will to finally to publish it. So we had 6 years of dry runs, which is way too many. You didn't need that many, but we just didn't get the green light to publish. And it actually then took a change in government. So in 2010, the Labour government was voted out, and a new government came in. And it was only through the change in government that they then gave the green light. I mean, just to add a bit of context to that, it was actually the 2008 financial crisis which really put a lot of pressure on government finances. And at the time, the Labour government had sort of overstretched themselves prior to the 2008 financial crisis, which really meant then that the public finances were under severe pressure. So that really made, that led to the change in government. And because financial statements are sort of backward-looking, the Conservatives were quite happy to say, well, let's go for whole-of-government accounts. It'll paint quite a gloomy picture of the UK economy, but the reasons lie in the past and not in the future.
No, absolutely. And the problem here is that the skepticism in me is kicking in because during the MIA conference 2021 and 2022 and now 2023, the government has been talking about accrual accounting. In fact, it has been made into a bill, but it sits at the speaker's table for a few years now. Not because of anything, but because it is not a prioritized statute that needs to be updated or amended. That's one element. Another idea is on the consolidation of the whole government account. We know how this is actually quite beneficial when it comes to capturing the true situation of the country. However, yet again, that conversation of whether or not the political will is there. Are there any champions inside the parliament, for instance? Are there any MPs or group of MPs or caucus that can actually champion this cause and make this particular bill see the light of day to be debated in the parliament? These are the questions that is always grappling us here as an observer outside of this kind of realm. Do you feel that we need to keep on being optimistic, try to pressure the necessary parties to actually make it work? Or do you feel that the ability for us to see things done, changes done, is actually quite bleak right now, at least when it comes to Malaysia?
Yeah, good question. I think, look, in the UK for hundreds of years, cash accounting was king, right? And human nature is such that you do get stuck in a certain way of doing things. And there are still today, after sort of 20 years plus of doing accruals accounting, there's still people now that are saying, well, I yearn back for the days of cash accounting. Things were simpler. We were still able to manage the economy, etc., etc. But I think the key really is to sort of chip away little by little, and that is by sort of just keep demonstrating, keep showing, keep talking about the positive usages of what accruals accounting can provide. And in the UK, you know, we do have some good allies. So not only the professional organisations like, you know, RCW like ourselves, but the other professional organisations as well, especially SIPFA, but also academics. You know, academics are very good at sort of telling us good story, you know, writing articles to sort of demonstrate the positives of accruals accounting. And if I can maybe just give one example, right? So say let's just take a health system, the health service with hospitals, you know, under cash, really, where a hospital, where does the cash go, right? It goes on into buying medicines and into paying staff. You know, they're sort of 80% of your costs. But under an accruals concept, you would then also look at the balance sheet. So you would look at the hospital building itself, and they're not cheap, right? And they need replacing. So in the UK, a lot of hospitals were built in the sort of 60s, and they used a certain type of concrete, and that concrete has now come to the end of its useful life, and the renovations are billions, right? And it's only under accruals accounting that if that asset's on your balance sheet, that you manage it, right? So, you know, under a cash basis, these expenditures, you wouldn't have sight of them. You would still have to pay them, but suddenly, you know, have you budgeted for them? So having a balance sheet, you know that you have to renew, you know, your hospitals at a certain point. It means that at least you can plan ahead for it. Whether you choose to do that or not is probably more of a political decision, but from an accounting point of view, you can provide them with the information to make those decisions.
There's also that whole idea of trying to communicate these ideas to non-financial background politicians that might not necessarily have the same empathy as you would when it comes to capturing true and fair accounting principles in the public sector. How do you then impress upon these non-financial background politicians, policymakers, in order for them to actually appreciate that this is indeed the way forward when it comes to trying to get better management of the public sector?
Yeah. So, you know, when a new political party comes in and new MPs get elected, you know, we do get excited when there are some accountants amongst the politicians, and there are always maybe 3 or 4, but we're talking out of, say, 400. Yeah. So we're not a lot. Yeah. So never a lot. But yeah, so politicians can come from all types of backgrounds, right? Some academic, some not. But the task of upskilling them actually lies with our National Audit Office. So we have a variety of what we call select committees. So these are committees made up of politicians of all different parties, of all colours, that then grill the finance directors on certain topics. And one of the committees is the Public Accounts Committee, and they specifically review the annual reports, bring in the finance directors and the key decision makers and grill them on the financials. So that particular select committee obviously has to have some familiarity with it. I must admit, it could be better. It is an area that we need to work on, but at the moment it's the National Audit Office that behind the scenes they upskill them and show them, you know, some of the key issues to look out for. It is something that ICAW have been calling for a while now to try and, generally speaking, get more financial literacy in that space, but also, to be honest, the rest of society as well. So we do have a few programs sort of, you know, going into schools and younger people just to uplift that sort of basic financial literacy. It is an important point you make, but yeah.
I understand that you will be speaking at the Attorney General's office. Has that happened?
It did yesterday, yes.
And I don't know how much you can share with us when it comes to that kind of conversation, but what we understand it is that you did speak to the AG's office on the consolidation of whole government accounts, sustainability reporting, issues on accounting for government assets, and many more. Maybe you can share with us some kind of, as much as you can, I suppose, when it comes to the ideas that you spoke at the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's nothing to hide there, I think. So yeah, I did come in as, you know, I did the whole of government accounts in the UK. I joined the Treasury in 2010 after having been at Barclays. And maybe one point to note sort of is that the transition between the private sector and public sector and back again for accountants is quite a frequent one, because we all essentially apply IFRS. So the same accounting framework,
yeah.
and you know the profession is well recognised within the public sector in the UK. So anyway, so I came from Barclays group finance position into whole of government accounts, and quite frankly, the core task wasn't too dissimilar, right? You've got a lot of different entities that you need to consolidate into one financial report. The only difference really what was lacking is any sort of due process. They hadn't implemented any processes yet. And I kind of like copied and pasted the process that we had at Barclays to follow at WGA in the Treasury. I think one of the sort of key challenges is, when you go into smaller entities, there are less professional accountants. So you'll have what we call generalists doing a finance type role, but they have a very sort of carved out niche, and it's quite a repetitive role. But when you're asking them to sort of look at the bigger picture, or you're asking them questions about, what the numbers are that have been provided, they very quickly lack the knowledge just because they're not accountants. They can't apply.
There's no malintent there. It's just the problem of unskilled in that particular respect.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how do you overcome that kind of issue?
Well, we had an extensive training program, and I must admit it took 3-4 years of people to even understand conceptually what WGA is. I mean, one of the key problems was the removal of all the intercompany balances, within government. So you have a lot of different grant streams that go all between government. And for them to just conceptually understand that they have to record that in quite a lot of detail. Don't just say, I've given it to the Department for Transport. You need to break it down, which element of transport has it gone to, so that the system can actually eliminate it. It took a long time, but we had, we offered everybody training, so for central government and for local government separately. For central government, we invited them in centrally, and we offered sort of 10 classes, 20 people each, so 200 plus people. And in local government, we actually scoured the country, so we spent about a month and a half going around the country, and we had 400, 500 people in the hall, all to try and learn how to do WGA.
And how did this, the Attorney General took to this kind of sharing session that you did with them?
Yeah, they had some really specific questions, especially around the valuation of property, plant and equipment, infrastructure assets in particular. They were interested, we have got a bit of a problem in the UK at the moment with different accounting policies. We have local government that have gone down a historic cost route, whereas the official accounting policy is one of current value, fair value. That causes problems. So they were interested in that aspect in particular, so infrastructure asset valuations. Yeah.
And of course, that whole idea of sustainability reporting, it has been seen to great lengths actually in the corporate sector of Malaysia, not necessarily in the public sector. When you shared the idea of sustainability reporting with the Attorney General's chambers, what was the reaction like for that office?
Yeah, I think, look, in the government, we are behind the curve, right? So I think it's fair to say that in Malaysia there hasn't been too much detailed thought about how the public sector could adopt a sustainability reporting process.
There's a reason for this, pardon me to interject, because in the private sector, investors are the ones that are applying pressure to the corporates to actually adopt better or clearer sustainability reporting. But that kind of pressure is not seen for the public sector, hence the government doesn't necessarily have the need or impetus to do better sustainability reporting or have any form of sustainability reporting for that matter. Do you feel that because of that no pressure, it requires the government to do more when it comes to applying themselves in reporting themselves better for sustainability reporting?
Well, coming back to that pressure point, I mean, you're right. That is the truth of the matter, and the same in UK and in other jurisdictions. But it actually annoys me a bit. Why isn't there the same pressure on governments? At the end of the day, governments have got huge spending power, more spending power than any individual company. And we saw it in COVID, right? All the big companies, they spent all their dividends to the investors, but then they still came for bailout money. Don't underestimate the power of government, right? And not only that, governments, are borrowing a lot of money in the bond market. So I think the majority of bonds are issued by government. Why are the investors not asking, for more pressure on that? I mean, it is starting to come. So with the emergence of green bonds, governments are now particularly issuing bonds just for green projects. So that pressure from the investor community, I think, is coming down the track for the government. But in any case, that's one thing. Let's just say the pressure isn't there. But I think from a societal point of view, sustainability reporting for government means more than what the private sector are currently doing. The private sector are taking the relevant frameworks, ISSB, TCFD in particular, but what those do, they just look at the risks and opportunities of climate, and when we say climate, it's CO2 primarily on the bottom line. Now, sustainability, if you'd mentioned the word sustainability 5 years ago in the context of public sector, that would have not meant climate. That would have probably meant sustainable finances.
I see. Okay, yeah.
Is your income more than your, more than your
Well,
expenditure?
the going concern question, I suppose.
That's right.
Yeah.
Whereas now, sustainability, we have so ESG.
Sorry, that did not click when you say sustainability reporting.
Yeah.
It no longer is seen in that context, I suppose.
It's not, is it?
Yeah.
So ESG, sustainability, climate, all these terms are sort of used intermittently, but at the moment, in my view anyway, it kind of boils down to CO2 emissions, the risk of the warming planet. And that is a real risk, don't get me wrong, but I think for me, governments have a wider remit than that, and that sort of links in with the SDGs to some extent. What I think governments should be looking at more is not just looking at the risk on the government itself, but you've got to look at the impact that government has on nature, but also society. That is the essence of what governments are there for. How do the policies, are the policies, useful for a just transition to net zero that will benefit all? The theme of the MI conference was, a better future, but it has to be a better future for all. And when I say all, it's not just human, like society, but it has to also be for nature. And the government has the power to do that.
Yeah, it has to be seen in all three, both environment, social, and governance as well. Exactly. One area that I want to explore with you is on the issue of carbon trading, particularly. Do you feel that accountants can actually come into the fray when it comes to trying to capture better transactions when it comes to carbon trading? Do you feel that this is an area that not many people are talking about yet?
Yeah, there's probably a reason for that. It's quite niche, and I've got to admit, it's not an area that I'm particularly familiar with. It simply isn't. I mean, from my point of view, where I see carbon trading, I mean, for me, I'd like to link it to sort of carbon pricing, right? And I think I would like to see governments price carbon more, because I think it is a route to valuing some of your natural assets. So that's my particular niche that I'm looking at, this sort of carbon trading in the wider economy with a carbon border tax. It is an important area to look at.
It's a good segue into the big topic that I want to discuss with you next, which is accounting for natural resources. And accounting for natural resources has been done quite extensively in the UK and some other markets around the world, but not necessarily so in Malaysia. When you shared the idea of accounting for natural resources with the Attorney General's Chambers office, how do you see this being reacted? How do they take to this idea?
Yeah, I think so. I actually, highlighted the IPSAS-B's project. So the IPSAS-B is International Public Sector Standards, and they have a natural resources standard. And the trouble is, if you look at that project or that, through the lens of financial reporting, you're very quickly into territories of not recognizing the assets because they don't meet the definition of an asset. And the reasons really are around sort of the control factors, but then also measurement uncertainty. And if you don't have the two, they don't meet the definition of an asset. But so this is what the discussion we had, because it does annoy me. If you go to anybody and say, "Is the Amazon an asset?" Everybody will say, "Yeah, of course it is."
But you can't capture it in an account.
You can't capture it in the accounts, and it's a way. Yeah. And in my view, this is my view. I think IFRS and a lot of the accounting frameworks they are
an asset. No, it's not.
But they are geared unashamedly to the bottom line, right? And this is we're into new territory, So should this asset, how can governments capture it on their balance sheet? And the public sector accounting standards have something called service potential, Is it a service potential? But then it means that the entity has to have as its core objective the preservation of a forest. Now again, in the public sector, that's not, are there any entities that have that as a core objective? Because if that's your core objective, then it has service potential for you, because leaving the forest untouched meets your objectives.
Yes.
So in that way, you might be able to put it on as an asset. Then the next question is, well, how do you measure it? And then it comes back to that sort of carbon pricing, right? Because forests obviously have an ability to absorb CO2, and that can be measured. So scientists can say, well, you have X hectares of this type of forest, and so the amount of carbon it absorbs. If you had a carbon price, you can then put a monetary value to that benefit. you know, this is then what we were discussing a little bit at the Accountant General's office. You know, would it be a fair value? Would it be a just value? And we agreed that it would probably still undervalue the forest, because basing it just on CO2 alone, you wouldn't capture any of the benefits of biodiversity. You wouldn't capture the benefits of sort of just pure human enjoyment. You know, just walking through a forest, hearing nature, breathing in the fresh air. That has value. We can't capture that. That's an intangible that we just can't capture at the moment.
What works right now in the UK that you think is practical to be implemented here in Malaysia when it comes to improving public sector reform, financial reform?
Yeah, what works in the UK? So, I mean...
Well, nothing works in the UK, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm having to... Yes, indeed. It's not been the best sort of last 4 or 5 years. However, I think the key lesson...
But that's not through the function of not having, a good standard body. It's the issue of politics
it's
again,
politics,
yet again. Yeah.
But I think, the key lesson, I think, is we demonstrated that we can just go through the motions of producing good financial data. So that's not the problem anymore. It's what do you do with that data? So it's getting the decision makers, getting the politicians to do more with it. And I do think it's on the accounting community within the public sector to do slightly more sexy things with it. Have your geographical analysis. Give them the data that they want. What's the regional? We have this thing called levelling up, which is a fancy word for regional policy. Certain areas of the UK underinvested. Use the data. Show what services. How has it been underinvested over what time period? What type of assets do they need to grow? We have the data. We just need a little bit of ingenuity and a little bit of will to just provide it. Chicken and the egg. The politicians will not ask for it.
Of course.
We're going to have to.
They don't know what to ask for.
Yeah, exactly. Put it on the table and say, look, this is all the great data we have, and then after a while, decisions will.
Hopefully,
be made
they can be inspired by some of the raw data that they have, and of course, this can be done and seen and implemented here in Malaysia as well. Considering that Malaysia is in a competitive market or competitive region, against very, very aggressive markets like Vietnam or Indonesia or Singapore or Thailand, there's this need for us to actually improve on a public sector financial reform quite aggressively. We've had a few governments, just like the UK, and a few other prime ministers, just like the UK. There's a lot of similarities in that sense. Do you feel that Malaysia is on a trajectory towards trying to get ourselves, get our act better when it comes to improving public sector financial reform?
Well, from what I've heard, I was very impressed that you have already a common chart of accounts. So that means you have all the account codes are shared the same across all entities. You have a standard central IT system that's, as far as I know, shared across most of government. That's already something I can only dream of in the UK, because it would make my life a lot more easier.
Yeah.
So there are positives in that sense. I think. So what I think a little bit, we elevated the finance profession within government over the last few years. So we created something called the government's finance function, just to recognise the professional nature that's required within government. So government transactions, government businesses have become a lot more complicated. Derivatives are starting to be used. 5-10 years ago, it wouldn't have done. Yeah. You are borrowing lots of money on the open market with some complex, arrangements being made. So complex transactions result in complex reporting. The reporting at the end of the day is only a reflection of the actions you take. But it does mean that you need people that can apply professional judgment to these. And the recognition simply wasn't there. So it meant that often accountants wouldn't hang around. They'd be lured by by the private sector basically. So in the UK, the government created this government finance function, and you get an accountancy allowance. So you get a salary uplift to recognise and to try and hold on to hold on to the professional accountants within the public sector. And I think that's something that maybe Malaysians, the government here could maybe look at, is just to give that extra recognition to the accountants.
Fantastic. What about your overall view of the MIA conference and some of the views that you have on Malaysia and some of the markets that you've been? I think you've been to Vietnam very recently.
Yeah, I went to Vietnam.
Yeah, so some quick takes, I guess, on this observations.
Okay, starting with the MIA conference, I'd never been before, and I'd never been to such a big conference, I think, of any type, so especially accountancy. So I thought it was extremely well run. The venue was fantastic. and all the conversations that I listened to were great. I think for me the biggest eye-opener was sort of the use and application of AI, you know, that chat GPT.
Oh, yeah, okay.
You know, I've never, I mean, obviously I knew about it, but
Yeah.
I'm astounded how many people are actually using it as a tool, you know, to increase
We use
their,
it daily here at the newsroom.
you know, to increase your productivity. So that's something that I'm going to go back to and see what I can do with it. So that really was eye-opening. And in Hanoi, so I only did Hanoi, not the Ho Chi Minh as well, but there was one thing, again, infrastructure assets that we're really keen on, right? But what they had this road built on top of a dike, and this dike was there to protect flooding from the river of the old part of town. Now the trouble is that they've built a dam in the hills to use as hydroelectricity, but with the rainfall and the water that was coming down, they could produce the hydro and then manage the river as well. Whereas now, you know, with less rainfall and also with China having also built a dam further upstream, it just means that there's now less water coming down. So in essence, they were asking me, how do we value this road on top of this dike? You know,
Oh, wow.
is
Okay.
it, you know, is there any value left in it being a dike? And I'm like, well, you know, you've told me you've not had flooding for the last 20 years due to those reasons. You know, if you were to rebuild the road, you wouldn't have to go through the expense of having it on an elevated section. You could just rebuild it, you know, on the flat on the ground.
level,
So it would essentially cost you less to rebuild. So have you got an impairment? Have you got a stranded asset? Why bother with this mound? Because, you know, you have one part of the town that can't even look over this road, you know. So I thought that was quite interesting. You know, so that was probably the first sort of real life example that I've come across of a stranded asset. You know, you've built this dike and you don't need it anymore. Changing climate.
Amazing. Sorry.
It is.
As you go around the world, you're going to see more cases like this, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. It has been a pleasure and an eye-opener speaking to you. That was Henning Diederik. I hope I pronounced it right.
That's good enough.
That's good enough. That's good as it gets. Technical Manager for the Public Sector Financial Reporting at the ICAEW. There's a lot of resources like this that can be found on astroawani.com. So do check that out. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.